Hello, my name is Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I'm continuing with my discussion on uh, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Now, I've discussed three cases already, notably Fred Korematsu's case, Gordon Hirabayashi, and I've also discussed uh, Minoru Yasui's case. Now, all three were Japanese Americans, and they were challenging the constitutionality of the internment. The internment, as I mentioned, had three elements to them. There was the curfews, there was the exclusion, and there was the internment. The courts, these cases all went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, following Executive Order 1966, which allowed, which was issued by Franklin Delano Roosevelt shortly after the attack by the Empire of Japan on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. So, due to wartime hysteria and, of course, racism against Japanese Americans, uh, you know, there were concerns that Japanese Americans might constitute some kind of fifth column. And so, even though you notice many of these plaintiffs were actually born in America, uh, they were, there was a term called Nisei Japanese, Nisei. So these were Japanese, Americans, people of Japanese ancestry who were born in the United States. Remember, we can see traces of xenophobia, racism against people of Asian ancestry, even in some of the laws we had. Remember, already we had um, the Immigration Act of 1917 under President Woodrow Wilson, which had the Asiatic bar, was reinforced by the Immigration Act of 1924 under President Calvin Coolidge, which barred immigration from Asian countries, right? Particularly Japan. So, although this was, during the Second World War, this happened in 1941. That's Executive Order 1966, uh, which was issued by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, allowing uh, the army to exclude, designate certain areas where they could exclude Americans, exclude certain people. And so there were a series of proclamations issued by uh, the commander of the Western Defense Command, Lieutenant General John DeWitt. And basically, he used that to impose curfews, exclude uh, Japanese Americans, and incarcerate them in mass detention facilities. So over 120,000 Japanese Americans were detained in this way. So remarkably, the cases I've discussed, the people who challenged the internment, the curfews, the exclusion, were Japanese Americans in their 20s. Again, they were Nisei, they were born in America, they were American citizens, they weren't immigrants, the plaintiffs who were challenging the constitutionality. And I've mentioned Fred Korematsu, I've mentioned Gordon Hibayashi, I've mentioned Hirabayashi, I've mentioned Minoru Yasui, and I apologize for the pronunciation of the names. I have a foreign name myself, so I don't want to butcher, uh, you know, the names of Americans. But these cases were all, uh, the plaintiffs lost in all these cases at the Supreme Courts, and all three were imprisoned. Now, how did this matter end? Because I know, we all know that 40 years later, the cases were overruled by the Supreme Court in various cases, notably Trump versus Hawaii in 2018. But prior to that, I'd mentioned in earlier videos how a writ of que coram nobis resident was filed. That's basically, it's called a writ of error, where we're saying, the court is saying that there was a fundamental error. There was a fundamental error, and it allows the courts to correct an earlier ruling because of a fundamental error. In this case, it was discovered later on that the Solicitor General at the time, Fahey, had withheld, he had suppressed evidence that which was provided by the FBI and the Office of Naval Intelligence, that the Japanese Americans did not pose a risk of espionage, and this would have been very significant. So, in the 80s, in the 1980s, long after the Second World War, long after the Japanese Americans had been released, many were already late, were already deceased. In the 1980s, particularly from 1983, the cases Korematsu, Yasui, and Hirabayashi, all against the United States, were all overruled, right? They were all voided, deemed unconstitutional. But so how did Japanese Americans get released? So I'm going to talk about another case today, and that's the case of ex parte Endo. So it's Mitsuye Endo, a young Japanese American lady. She was just 22 years old at the time of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and she had been working at the California Department of Motor Vehicles, which was unusual because Japanese Americans, due to the prejudice against them at that time, didn't have state jobs. So unusually, it shows, she was highly valued in the way she was one of the few Nisei or Japanese Americans who actually had government jobs. So she had a job with the California Department of Motor Vehicles, but she was fired after, in the wake of the bombing of Pearl Harbor and after America entered the war against Japan. And, she was harassed, like many Japanese Americans at the time, and then she was fired from her job. And she was then, sent to a detention camp. She was staying at the Lake Two in camp in California with her family. Now, at some point, she filed a writ of habeas corpus because she was an American citizen. She filed a writ of habeas corpus to be released, because she was a law-abiding American citizen. Remember the writ of habeas corpus I've talked about. I've done an earlier video in which I talked about how the writ of habeas corpus, Alexander Hamilton described this as it was very fundamental to, our liberty and our republicanism, right? And it's considered the most powerful rule of law that an American has in his arsenal. It's not just an American; it's actually applicable to anyone within U.S. jurisdiction. So she filed a writ of habeas corpus. Remember, Korematsu had said that the internment, the exclusion and internment, violated his Fifth Amendment rights, but his Fifth Amendment rights of due process. He didn't use the 14th Amendment because the 14th Amendment has, the 14th Amendment deals, it goes to, it provides, it's applicable to the states. So it's a federal challenging the states. So it's a federal law that challenges the states. While in this case, it was the federal government that was actually detaining Japanese Americans. So he had to use the Fifth Amendment against the federal government, right? So in the case of Endo was saying that, the detention was violating her, her right of habeas corpus, right? That she's a loyal American citizen. In fact, Endo was born in she was not only born in America, she was a practicing Christian, just like Gordon Hirabayashi, but she had never even been to Japan, and she could not speak Japanese. Right? She was born and raised speaking English, right? And she'd never traveled to Japan before. She had a job with the California Department of Motor Vehicles in Sacramento. Of course, she was fired. So her objective was to be released from the camp, from the detention facility, from the mass incarceration, right, and return to work. So she filed this, sometime in 1942. It was still first of all heard at the state level. Ironically, a judge would deny her appeal, would deny her petition for writ of habeas corpus, right? The writ of habeas corpus, I've explained what that is. The full Latin is habeas corpus ad sub justitiandum, which it means, you shall produce the body to be examined. And that's, saying that, anybody who's been imprisoned, they have a right to appear before a judge challenging the legality of the imprisonment, right? So it's supposed to prevent arbitrary imprisonment. So a judge, his name was Joseph Roche, he denied the petition without any explanation. Ironically, the irony of this is that the judge who denied the petition, Judge Roche, was actually an immigrant himself. He wasn't born in America. He was born in Ireland, right? So I don't want to talk about levels of citizenships because we don't have two tiers of citizenship in America. I'm a naturalized American citizen. And under the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, right, the U.S. born citizen, the one born in America, and the naturalized citizen, they're equal, right? We don't have two tiers of citizenship. But in practice, we see that's not the case. So it's ironic that the judge who was actually born, who was actually deciding the writ of habeas corpus petition of an American-born citizen who had never traveled out of America. She had never been to Japan. That's uh, uh, Endo. The judge who was deciding the case was foreign born. He was actually born in Ireland. The difference, he was a white American, right? He was born in Ireland, but Endo had Japanese ancestry. So you can see the lingering, discrimination, the against Japanese Americans, people of Asian descent at that time, and that was why I pointed out the extant laws, immigration laws of trying to exclude Asians, including the 1917 Immigration Act under President Woodrow Wilson and the Immigration Act of 1924 under President Calvin Coolidge. So there was this uh, racial prejudice against Japanese Americans, especially in the wake of the assault and by the attack from the Empire of Japan, on Pearl Harbor, and now America was at war with Japan, and of course, so the case, the case was then appealed to the Ninth Circuit. So you see, the Ninth Circuit was hearing a lot of cases on the internment, regarding the internment, and Endo was a remarkable woman. She decided to be a test case for some lawyers decided to help her. One of them was Saburo Kido. He was president of the Japanese American uh, Citizens League, and another civil rights attorney decided to represent her without a fee, for free. His name was James Purcell. So they were representing her, and because she was an ideal, she had the profile they wanted. This is just similar to Rosa Parks. When NAACP decided to use uh, Rosa Parks to challenge the constitutionality of the segregation laws in Brown. Well, they didn't use her at the time. They would use. They supported Rosa Parks, right? Let me not get into the civil. So the civil rights cases was a combination cases that ended segregation, right? They were a combination of many different cases, just like Brown v. Board that NAACP challenged. So it was NAACP that was pivotal, in a number of these cases. Now, what's important, I'm not just digressing here because a reason I wanted to talk about the Endo case today, Endo ex parte Endo, was because the decision, the success of the Endo case were prefigured the subsequent desegregation cases, civil rights litigation that ended Jim Crow laws in the South, including Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So you have to remember that even though the court was mute on the case of, they didn't say anything, they didn't mention the constitutionality of the internment itself, right? They would sidestep that issue and deal with other things like, okay, exclusion and things like that, and even or detention, right? So they would separate. They would just do some kind of legal fiction, legerdemain, and evade the incarceration itself, right? They would avoid that. Remember that exclusion, right? Exclusion, that's segregation. We're being segregated. Segregation was actually lawful in most of America, right? There were Jim Crow laws. Schools were segregated in the South. So Brown v. Board saying segregation was illegal had not yet come up in 1954. So the success of Endo, uh, you know, it would later instigate uh, the later success of the civil rights desegregation cases. But in any event, so Endo was supported by Saburo Kido, who was president of the Japanese American Citizens League, and of course James Purcell. So so they filed a writ of habeas petition. Writ of habeas petition is supposed to be heard very quickly. However, of course, again, Judge Roche was born in Ireland, but he was a white American. He was a white male. He was an American, but naturalized. He was an immigrant. He denies the writ of habeas petition, writ of habeas, writ of habeas corpus petition of American-born Japanese American uh, uh, Mitsuye Endo. He denies the petition. So her attorneys then file an appeal to the Ninth Circuit. So you see, the Ninth Circuit was hearing a lot of these internment cases. The Ninth Circuit decides to send it over to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court was hearing the Korematsu case at that time. The Supreme Court decides to make a decision, right, concurrently with its Korematsu decision. So paradoxically, while Korematsu failed, the Supreme Court said, well, it was constitutional for the government exclude um, to exclude Korematsu. So Korematsu failed at the Supreme Court. Um, the Supreme Court paradoxically said that that Endo could not be detained, so she was successful. So the opinion was written by Justice William Douglas, and he uh, bizarrely said that while they had ruled that it was constitutional to hold Korematsu, well, he bizarrely, not to hold him, but that the exclusion, the original exclusion, was constitutional. He was now saying that the government could not detain a concededly loyal citizen, right? And it was unlawful for the government to continue to detain a concededly loyal citizen. And so it was this decision that led to the closing of the incarceration camps and allowed Japanese Americans to return to the West Coast. So prior to that, let me give a prelude. Prior to that, um, the government chief attorney, right, for it was called the War Relocation Authority. By the way, back then there wasn't a Department of Defense. Department of Defense was created later on in 1947 by under President Truman. Basically, it's unified all the military departments, the Department of the Navy, Department of the Army, and then the Department of the Air Force was subsequently, was created out of the Department of Army, became independent, but they all came under the umbrella of the Department of Defense, Secretary of the Department of Defense. But during the Second World War, we didn't have that Department of Defense. So we had the Department of War. So it's funny that now under President Trump, we've gone back to calling the Department of Defense Department of War. So it's called Department of War. So back then, during the Second World War, it was called the Department of War. So the Department of War was criticized in this opinion in Ex parte Endo. Uh, it was the court laid the blame on the army, criticizing the Department of War, saying that it basically labeled it as a rogue agency within the government for detaining American citizens. So it was now making it seem like, well, this detention, violating habeas corpus, was a rogue action, and it was not authorized by the president himself through Executive Order 1966. Right, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 1966 and allowed the military to issue all these proclamations that targeted and excluded and interned Japanese Americans, right? Um, in fact, there was also Public Law 503, which criminalized the violation of these military orders. And that's why Korematsu and Yasui, that's why they were imprisoned, that's why they were detained, right? That's why they were convicted. So the combination of Executive Order 1966, which allowed the military to exclude Americans from any area. So what the military did was they made the West Coast. Uh, uh, they made the West Coast military areas in which they excluded Japanese Americans. They first of all restricted their movements through curfews, and then eventually they excluded them, and then they relocated them to these internment camps, mass internment camps, over 120,000 of them. And these were sanctioned by Congress. The programs were funded by Congress because the government was now feeding, housing them, and all that. And, in a case, in the dissent in Korematsu, right? Remember, three justices had dissented in Korematsu, including Owen Roberts, Frank Murphy, uh, Justice Robert Jackson. These three had dissented. I'm going to do a video later on discussing their dissent because their dissent is very important. One of them, I think it was Frank Murphy, had actually drawn a parallel to the internment camps with the Nazi concentration camps that the Nazis had placed Jewish people in which they were exterminating them. So Justice Murphy, I think it was him. It was Justice Murphy. He had said it. Frank Murphy. He stated that uh, you know America was actually these laws were basically saying that it was constitutional to engage in an action which the nation, the tyrannical dictatorship they were in war against, were actually instituting against their uh, their minorities, right? So this was a it was a very concerning era, and the courts failed. So you see, in Endo, ex parte Endo, the court is, they're sort of absolving themselves. I'm going to revisit the cases, the arguments in Korematsu, because the judge again, the way the justices reasoned um, in Korematsu, they were doing again uh, some kind of legal fiction, legal legerdemain um, in the argument. So I'm going to do a video visiting those arguments separately, so I don't make this video too long. Um, I can't actually see the timer here, but so Endo was very significant because that was how uh, the the internment of Japanese Americans basically ended. Again, Justice William um, Douglas, he wrote his opinion, but again, it was disingenuous. Just it was sort of disingenuous for the justice to blame the army for an action that was authorized, sanctioned by the President of the United States and funded by Congress, because the Japanese Americans were being fed in these uh, incarceration camps they were in. They were being fed, they were being housed, and this went on for years. It went on from 1942 to about 1945. So President Roosevelt, when he realized that the court was going to make a decision in Endo and say that it was unconstitutional to continue to detain loyal American citizens, again, because these Japanese Americans, there was no evidence. American knew that they were loyal, right? So he knew that it was going to be declared unconstitutional. So on December 17, 1944, he issued what was called Proclamation um, number 21, which rescinded the exclusion of Japanese Americans from the West Coast, and so it led to the closure of the internment camps, in 1945. So in 1942, sorry, in 1945, January 2, 1945, they started, the process of releasing Japanese Americans, and they were free to relocate to the West Coast. Ironically, um, the chief attorney for the War Relocation Authority, which was responsible for detaining Endo and, of course, the other Japanese Americans, had offered Endo to, with to end her case. They'd offered her uh, to offer to release her if she did not return to the West Coast, right? They offered to release her if she did not return to the West Coast. Again, I'm visiting these cases because we operate under the rule of law in America. I've talked about my spiel. I started doing these videos, and I've talked about how I've been facing color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts. Um, so I was a victim of an emergency petition, right? So they used an emergency violation petition to violate my constitutional rights, and I was detained wrongfully. I'm a law-abiding American citizen. I've done videos discussing everything. I was wrongfully detained, and eventually, I was offered that the fake charges that were filed against me would be dismissed if I uh, offer or agree to go back to Nigeria and not return to America. I'm an American citizen, right? So you can see things that are unconstitutional. So I don't want to digress, because that's a whole new narrative that I have to do a deep dive into. But I'm just trying to give the parallel so you can see why these cases, these internment cases, are sort of really interesting to me, because um, they're significant because marginalized people, minorities, face attacks to their constitutional rights by under color of law, right? They use color of legality, right, to abuse our rights sometimes based on racism and xenophobia. And we see this is what happened during the Second World War. Ironically, it was young people. I'm a middle aged man, but it was young people in their 20s who challenged these laws as plaintiffs in that went all the way to the US Supreme Court. For the most part, Japanese Americans, right, they complied, they cooperated with the government to abuse their constitutional rights. And so the case of Endo, she had initially been offered to be released, but under the condition that she doesn't return to the West Coast. Um, but she refused, right? She refused because, again, remember, her attorneys, they were, addressing the constitutionality of the detention. And so it wasn't just her. They wanted to address the bad legal precedent that this was setting. And this was something Justice Jackson had said. He said that, look, if they if the court didn't address the say that it was unconstitutional for the uh, for the military to intern Japanese Americans on en masse in the Korematsu case, then it would set a bad precedent, right, to violate the constitutional rights of Americans during emergencies, right, during emergencies, and so that's sort of the bad precedent that uh, the Supreme Courts of Korematsu and Yasui and Hirabayashi were trying to set. Of course, these were all voided through quorum. They all void through writ of error in the 1980s, starting with the 1983. But it's funny that America likes to make a hero out of its victims decades later, even when many of them are dead. Yasui was already dead, when these cases were deemed unconstitutional, you know. And again, we talk about these three plaintiffs who were very courageous. They were young people. They were in their 20s. That's why they got to uh, live so long. They were still alive when 40 years after the cases were deemed unconstitutional and reprehensible, right? They were deemed, odious and a discredited artifact of popular bigotry. They were deemed a stain to American jurisprudence. They were young people who got to live uh, when they were now deemed by mainstream America as heroes, 40 years after their rights had been violated, after they'd been dehumanized. You know, so in any event, let me go back to the case of Endo. So on December 17, 1944, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in favor of Endo for her to be released, saying that you know the government could not continue to detain a concededly loyal American citizen, and of course, it was December 18, 1944, when it made its decision. Again, paradoxically, it said that the case of Korematsu, the exclusion of Korematsu and his arrest, his imprisonment was constitutional, right? So the government was saying that it was illegal to detain Japanese Americans, place them in internments. Again, the courts evaded the issue of the internment in the first place, right? But he was saying that the laws that imprisoned uh, the laws that imprisoned the Japanese Americans who refused that mass imprisonment that the court was, hadn't really said much on. Uh, they were constitutional. So it's funny how the courts skirted the issues because it's they're complex matters. That's why I'm going to do a separate video just addressing how there these paradoxes. Again, I mentioned how Hugo Black in Korematsu had said, look, that it was a military necessity that was causing the Japanese Americans to be imprisoned en masse, and not because of any animus or animosity towards people of Japanese ancestry, not because of race, right? That's something called circular reasoning. That's begging the question. Begging the question is a form of fallacious reasoning, and so that's what Justice Hugo Black was doing there. Um, in any event, the Endo case led to the eventual release of Japanese Americans and the closure of the camps in 1945. Um, so I just wanted to talk about, um, the remarkable young lady Endo. She refused the offer to be released early on condition that she didn't return to the West Coast, and she stayed for another 18 months for the hearing and decision at the Supreme Court on December 18, 1944. However, ironically, because she wanted to go back, her contention was that she wanted to return to the West Coast, to Sacramento, and get her job back at the California Department of Motor Vehicles. Ironically, what she waited for when she was released, she never returned to the West Coast. She went to settle in Chicago, and she went to work for the city's Human Rights Commission. And she lived a very private life. She didn't get a presidential medal of freedom like Korematsu or Gordon Hirabayashi did. She lived a private life, and again, she was another remarkable, courageous young Japanese American, and her case would set the precedent, would be the trigger for other civil rights cases that would unravel segregation. Because remember, the internment of Japanese was also dealing with segregation, right? They were excluded, right? Segregation is a form of exclusion. That's just another term, which was legal, right? In America at the time, most of America, the South, especially with the Jim Crow laws. So I'm going to I wanted to just give the overview, and I'll get into the legal matters, the legal issues in a subsequent video. Again, I've talked about how there was a lot of legal fiction, bad legal reasoning in these cases. Justice Hugo Black had said, is known to have said that, well, he ruled in the favor, in the majority against Korematsu, saying that it was constitutional for the government to mass incarcerate Japanese Americans in Korematsu and the other cases, because uh, so as he said, uh, somebody had to run the war. He said either Roosevelt or the Supreme Court had to run the war. And he said, obviously, the Supreme Court can't run the war. And so they gave deference to the executive, right? He gave deference to the executive. And that's why he ruled supporting the constitutionality of the bad discriminatory orders of President Roosevelt. right? I talked about how, their legal reasoning was faulty. So again, the case is Korematsu, Hirabayashi, Yasui. They're considered anti-canon law because remember, I've done a video discussing the standards of scrutiny. They're called, standards of judicial review to check the constitutionality of a law. And, because this dealt with, a suspect class, it dealt with a matter of race, national origin, that being Japanese Americans. The legal standard, the standard of scrutiny that should have been used was the most rigorous, right? The most rigorous, the most severe, which is called strict scrutiny. And it deals with uh, suspect classifications or when the law is dealing with a fundamental right. In this case, it was, race, national origin, and it requires the law to be narrowly tailored and, to meet the compelling government interest. And normally, it's, those laws are deemed uh, unconstitutional, and so the government has the burden of proof to prove to establish the constitutionality of the laws. The courts failed to apply this standard in Hirabayashi. They used uh, the least severe standard, uh, which is the rational basis. Rational basis is minimum scrutiny. The burden of proof goes to uh, the individual challenging the right the right that's been violated, the law, challenging the law, violating their rights, and the government just has to show that there's a rational basis. Uh, uh, there's a relationship. There's a rational basis for the legitimate government interest. That has a legitimate government interest, saying that there's a rational basis uh, that creates a legitimate government interest. Um, and in this case, the burden of proof is on the challenger, the plaintiff. This was bizarrely used in the Hirabayashi case, and the same court now used the Hirabayashi case as precedent for the uh, for the uh, Korematsu case. However, they claimed they used strict scrutiny, right? But they arrived at the wrong decision in the Korematsu case. I'll do a video and talk, generally about those legal standards and the thinking of the courts. Um, so let me stop here. It's gotten rather long. My name is Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I'd already mentioned uh, during the narrative how I've been detained. I've suffered a rights deprivation under color of law violations, um, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.